It has been 6 months since my son and his wife tore the heart out of my home. The air where my roses used to be still smells of diesel and overturned earth, a raw, sterile scent that has replaced the sweet, complex perfume of Arthur's legacy. Every morning, I open the back door, and the smell is the first thing that hits me, a daily reminder of the betrayal. It's a wound in the earth that mirrors the one in my soul. They called it landscaping, an upgrade. I call it desecration. For 40 years, that garden was the soul of this property, and for the last 4.5 years since Arthur passed, it was the only thing I had left of him. It was more than just a collection of plants. It was a living library of our life together. Each rose had a story, a memory embedded in its thorns and petals. The Pieces rose we planted after our first big fight. The Mr. Lincoln that Arthur gave me on our 20th anniversary, its deep red petals the exact shade of the velvet box that held my new ring. And his pride, the Arthur's Light, a pale yellow hybrid he'd spent a decade perfecting, the one that won him the Regional Horticultural Society Award 3 years in a row. My son Shane and his wife Paige never saw any of that. They looked at that vibrant, living tapestry and saw only a financial asset, a patch of prime real estate to be exploited, an empty space on a blueprint. Shane was my only child, Arthur's and mine. We'd raised him in this house, surrounded by the scent of loam and blooming roses. He'd made his little mud pies right where the Queen Elizabeth Grandiflora used to stand. But the man he'd become was a stranger to me, a man sculpted by ambition, and a woman who measured love in square footage and property value. Paige was all sharp angles and modern aesthetics. She spoke of clean lines and monochromatic palettes, and her eyes would skim over my comfortable memory-filled home with a barely concealed flicker of disdain. To her, my life's collection of souvenirs and Arthur's antique furniture was just clutter. But the garden she truly despised. She called it messy and overgrown, a chaotic explosion of color that offended her minimalist sensibilities. For 2 years they had been working on me. It started subtly. "You know, Mom," Shane would say, draping an arm around my shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a claim of ownership than affection. "If we cleared out some of these bushes, we could have a really amazing entertainment space." Paige would chime in, her voice a smooth, persuasive purr. "Imagine it, Martha. A beautiful stone patio, maybe a small pool or a water feature. It would add so much value to the property." They talked about the house as if it were already theirs, a stock they were waiting to mature. I always gave them the same answer. "No, the garden was your father's. It stays." I thought that was enough. I thought the finality in my voice, the deep and unwavering love for my late husband that fueled it, would be a barrier they couldn't breach. How naive I was. I underestimated the corrosive power of greed. I underestimated their capacity for cruelty. The final conversation before the end happened on a Sunday afternoon. They'd come over for dinner, a weekly ritual I had come to dread. Paige was scrolling through her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I saw the most perfect outdoor kitchen design today," she announced to no one in particular. "It would fit perfectly right where that big thorny thing is." She meant Arthur's Light. My hand holding my wine glass trembled slightly. "Paige, we've discussed this," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "The garden is not up for discussion." Shane sighed, a theatrical sound of a long-suffering son dealing with a difficult parent. "Mom, be reasonable. It's a bunch of thorny bushes. Dad's gone. Life moves on. We're trying to improve this place for everyone. For everyone. He meant for them. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. They weren't asking anymore. They were telling. It is not just a bunch of thorny bushes to me, Shane. It's your father's memory. Paige finally looked up from her phone, her expression a perfect mask of bored condescension. She laughed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. Oh, Martha, don't be so sentimental. It's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I didn't have an answer for that. The callousness of it stole the air from my lungs. I just stared at them, at my son who looked at me with impatient pity, and his wife who saw my deepest feelings as a source of amusement. 2 days later, I drove to my sister Clara's house for my annual 3-day visit. It was a trip we made every year for her birthday. They knew I'd be gone. They counted on it. I returned to a war zone. The moment I turned onto my street, I knew. The air was different. The low rumble of heavy machinery still vibrated in the asphalt. There was a huge yellow bulldozer parked on my front lawn, its metal treads caked in mud. I stumbled out of the car, my purse sliding from my shoulder and hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Where the riot of color and life had been, there was nothing but a rectangle of churned brown earth. It was a grave. They had dug a grave for my heart. My legs gave out, and I sank to my knees on the sidewalk, the rough concrete scraping my skin. I didn't feel it. All I could feel was the gaping silent void where 40 years of love and life had been. Shane and Paige came out of the house, beaming. Shane yelled, spreading his arms wide, as if presenting me with a brand new car. What do you think? It's a blank slate. We can start planning the patio this weekend. I couldn't speak. I could only look at the devastation, at the broken stems and shredded roots mixed in with the dirt. I saw a flash of pale yellow, a single mangled petal from Arthur's light, and a sob tore its way from my chest. It was a raw animal sound of pure agony. My pain seemed to amuse them. Paige let out that same sharp laugh. See, Shane, I told you she was sentimental. They walked back into my house, my son and his wife, leaving me kneeling on the pavement in front of the tomb they had made of my life. In the days that followed, I moved through my house like a ghost. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Before, the gentle rustle of leaves and the hum of bees in the roses was the constant background music of my life. Now, there was nothing. The house felt hollow, an empty shell. I would stand at the kitchen window, staring at the muddy pit, and the grief would wash over me in suffocating waves. It wasn't just the loss of the garden, it was the violent, deliberate erasure of Arthur. It was the confirmation of what I had suspected for years, that to my son, my life, my love, my memories were all worthless obstacles in the path of his own desires. He hadn't just bulldozed some roses, he had bulldozed me. My grief was a physical weight. I couldn't eat. Sleep offered no escape. As my dreams were filled with the roar of the engine and the sight of metal teeth tearing into the earth, I would wake up with my heart pounding, the smell of diesel still phantom thick in my nostrils. During those first few weeks of shock, my mind kept retreating into the past, seeking refuge in the very memories that Shane and Paige had tried to obliterate. I remembered the day Arthur and I bought this house. It was a modest little place, but it had a huge, sun-drenched backyard. Before we even unpacked the first box, Arthur was out there, his sleeves rolled up, turning over the soil. He'd brought a single bare-root rosebush with him from his mother's house. "This is a Peace's rose, Martha," he'd said, his face alight with a passion I adored. We'll plant it first, a foundation of peace for our home. He dug the hole with his bare hands, crumbling the soil between his fingers as if he were a baker working with precious flour. We planted it together, our hands touching in the cool earth. That single bush was the beginning of everything. It was the anchor of our shared life. Over the next 40 years, that garden grew with our family. It chronicled our journey. When Shane was born, Arthur planted a whole bed of fairies' roses, tiny pink blossoms that he said matched our son's perfect little fingers. For our 10th anniversary, a golden celebration with blooms the color of sunshine. For my 50th birthday, the Grace de Monaco, because he always said I was his princess. The garden wasn't a hobby for him. It was his language. It was how he expressed the love he sometimes struggled to put into words. I remember Shane as a little boy, toddling through the rose beds, his face smudged with dirt. He had a little red watering can, and he would diligently help his father, mostly by watering his own feet. Arthur would laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that made the birds in the old oak tree take flight. "He's got the touch, Martha," he'd say. "He's a natural." But the boy who loved the dirt grew into a man who only loved what was clean and new and expensive. The change began when he met Paige in college. She came from new money, a family that had built a sterile empire of strip malls and glass-walled office buildings. She taught Shane to be ashamed of his roots, of the dirt under his father's fingernails. She taught him that value was something you found on a bank statement, not in the unfurling of a perfect petal. I saw the shift, the way he stopped coming out to the garden with his father, the way he started talking about maximizing assets and leveraging equity. Arthur saw it too. It broke his heart. Though he rarely spoke of it, he would just spend more time among his roses, pruning and feeding them, as if their quiet, steadfast beauty was the only antidote to the creeping chill of his son's ambition. And then there was Leo, my nephew, my late sister's boy. Leo was the son Arthur had always hoped Shane would be. He was a quiet, gentle soul, an artist who couldn't seem to find a foothold in the world. He worked odd jobs, mostly landscaping for people who wanted cookie-cutter lawns and perfectly manicured hedges. He was broke, always, but his spirit was rich. He would come over every few weeks, not out of duty, but out of genuine love. He and Arthur had been two peas in a pod. They could spend hours together in the garden, speaking in the hushed, reverent tones of true believers, debating the merits of bone meal versus fish emulsion, or the best way to combat black spot. After Arthur passed, Leo kept coming. He'd find me struggling with a heavy bag of mulch, or trying to prune the climbing Don Juan on the trellis, and he'd just quietly take the tools from my hands. "Let me get that for you, Aunt Martha," he'd say with a small, sad smile. He never asked for a penny. We'd work for hours, and then we'd sit on the back steps with glasses of iced tea, and he would ask me to tell him stories about Arthur. He would point to a specific rose. "Which one is that again? What's its story?" He listened. He remembered. He saw the library, not just the leaves. He understood that the garden wasn't a plot of land. It was a testament. He was helping me preserve it, not for any reward, but because he loved his uncle, and he loved me. The contrast between Leo's gentle reverence and Shane's brutal dismissal was a chasm that could never be crossed. The catalyst, the moment the deep, agonizing wound of grief began to harden into something else, something cold and sharp and resolute, came about 3 weeks after the destruction. Shane and Paige came over, unannounced. I was in the kitchen, staring at the mud pit, when they breezed in. Paige was holding a thick, glossy brochure. She spread it out on my kitchen table, covering the faint ring stains and worn patches of the old wood with its slick, impersonal surface. "Okay, Mom," Shane said, his voice full of a forced, brittle cheerfulness. "We've got some great options here." I'm leaning towards the travertine tiles for the patio, and Paige found a fantastic saltwater pool that's practically self-cleaning. Paige pointed to a picture of a sleek, minimalist patio set, all gray cushions and black metal, and "This is the furniture I was telling you about. Isn't it chic? It will completely modernize the space. We can host my boss's annual summer party here. It'll be incredible for our networking." They were talking, planning, dreaming, right on top of the grave of my husband's soul. They hadn't just failed to show remorse, they were actively celebrating their victory. I looked from their excited faces to the brochure, then out the window at the muddy scar. And that's when it happened. The sorrow didn't disappear, but it transmuted. It crystallized into a single diamond-hard point of clarity. They felt nothing, they understood nothing, and they would never ever stop unless they were stopped. A quiet voice in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded a lot like Arthur's, whispered a single powerful word: Codicil. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about justice. It was about honoring the man they had so carelessly dishonored. But as I looked at my son's smiling, expectant face, I felt a new, unfamiliar chill spread through my veins, and I had to admit to myself, in that quiet, terrible moment, that maybe it was about to become about revenge too. A memory, sharp and vivid as if it had happened yesterday, pushed its way through the fog of my grief. I was suddenly back in Mr. Albright's office, the air thick with the smell of old books and lemon polish. It was a few months before Arthur's final decline, before the cancer had stolen his strength, but not his foresight. He had called the meeting. He sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, looking smaller than usual, but his eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. I sat beside him, and our lawyer, a kind, solemn man named Howard Albright, sat opposite us. Arthur had a file in his hands. It was our will. "Martha," Arthur began, his voice a little raspy but firm, "Howard and I have made a small addition, a codicil." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood towards me. I picked it up. The language was dense, legalistic, but the intent was crystal clear. It stated that the bulk of his investment portfolio, a sum that had grown to be quite substantial over the decades, far more than Shane or anyone else knew, was not to be distributed immediately upon his death. Instead, it would be held in trust for 5 years. At the end of that 5-year period, the entire portfolio would be bequeathed to the heir, who had actively and faithfully maintained and preserved his award-winning rose garden. I remember looking at him, confused. "Arthur, why? Shane will inherit the house. He'll be here." Arthur reached across the desk and placed his hand over mine. His skin felt like dry paper. "Martha, my love, you know our son. He is a good man in many ways, but he lacks patience. He lacks an appreciation for things that don't offer an immediate return. He does not have a gardener's soul." He looked from me to Howard, then back again. "This garden, it's my life's work, besides you and Shane. It's a test of character. It requires dedication, love, and respect for the past. It will take care of the person who takes care of it. It will choose its own guardian. He had looked directly into my eyes then, and I saw the deep loving sorrow in his. He knew his son. He knew that Shane's ambition, fanned by Paige's materialism, was a fire that could consume anything in its path. This codicil wasn't an act of spite, it was an act of profound heartbreaking foresight. It was his way of ensuring his life's true passion, and the wealth that came from his life's work, would end up with someone who understood the value of tending to something beautiful. Back in my kitchen, with the glossy patio brochure mocking me from the table, that memory was a lightning strike. I stood up, my movements stiff. "Get out," I said. Shane and Paige stared at me, their smiles faltering. "What?" Shane asked. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Get out of my house." My voice was low, but it held a core of steel they had never heard before. They saw something in my eyes that startled them, a cold fire that replaced the familiar gentle warmth. They gathered the brochure and backed away, muttering about me being overly emotional, about my grief making me irrational. The moment the door closed behind them, I went to Arthur's old study. In the bottom drawer of his desk was a heavy mahogany box. It held our marriage certificate, our birth certificates, and our wills. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the small brass latch. I pulled out the thick vellum paper of Arthur's last will and testament. I flipped past the standard bequeathals, the house to Shane, a modest sum to me, personal items to various relatives, until I found it. The codicil, stapled securely to the back. I read it again and again, the words burning themselves into my mind. Actively and faithfully maintained and preserved. Forfeiture. Their act of destruction was an act of forfeiture. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I sat down heavily in Arthur's old leather chair. It still faintly smelled of him, of pipe tobacco and old spice. It was as if he were there with me, giving me strength. My first call was to Howard Albright. His voice was the same as I remembered from that day in his office, calm, grave, and reassuring. "Martha," he said, his tone full of warmth. "It's good to hear your voice, though I wish it were under better circumstances. I heard about the garden. I am so terribly sorry." I explained what had happened, my voice breaking as I described the bulldozer and the mud. I told him about Shane and Paige's plans for a pool. He was silent for a long moment when I finished. "The fools," he finally breathed. "The arrogant, short-sighted fools." I asked him about the codicil. Is it really enforceable, Howard? Enforceable? His voice took on a new energy. "Martha, Arthur and I spent 2 months with the best estate lawyers in the state drafting that clause. It is as ironclad as a bank vault. The language is precise and unambiguous. The destruction of the garden constitutes a complete and undeniable breach of the codicil's conditions on Shane's part. He has, in no uncertain terms, forfeited his claim." The relief that flooded through me was so immense it felt like I might float away, but then a new thought grounded me. "But Howard, if Shane has forfeited, what happens to the portfolio? Does it just go to charity?" That's when Howard asked the question that changed everything. "Martha, the codicil names the heir who maintains the garden. Has anyone else been helping you with it? Someone who could be considered a contingent beneficiary, another blood relative?" And my mind immediately flew to Leo. Quiet, kind, gentle Leo. "My nephew," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Leo, he's been helping me for years, since before Arthur passed, and consistently since. He was just here last month, helping me deadhead the Ingrid Bergman roses. Can you prove it, Martha? Do you have any documentation? Photos? Witnesses? Anything? My mind started racing. Documentation. I was a meticulous gardener, just like Arthur. I had a journal, a thick leather-bound book where I noted bloom times, fertilizer schedules, and pest problems. I flipped through it every year, and there, scrawled in my own handwriting, were countless entries. Leo came by, helped me turn the compost. Leo pruned the climbers. Much better job than I could do. Leo spotted aphids on the Just Joey sprayed with soap. It was all there. A 4.5-year chronicle of his quiet dedication. I even had photos on my old digital camera. Photos of Leo, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, smiling proudly, next to a particularly beautiful bloom of Arthur's light. I had receipts from the nursery for bags of organic rose food that he had picked up for me. I have everything, Howard, I said, a sense of awe in my voice. I have a journal. I have photos. I have receipts. I could practically hear Howard smiling through the phone. Martha, that is more than enough. That is a fortress. Leo has, by the letter and the spirit of Arthur's will, been the one actively and faithfully maintaining the garden. He is the rightful heir. My next call was to Leo. He answered on the second ring, his voice hesitant, as if he expected a bill collector. Aunt Martha, is everything okay? I took a deep breath. I couldn't tell him everything. Not yet. It would be too much of a shock. Leo, honey, I need your help with something. It's a legal matter concerning your Uncle Arthur's estate. I could hear his confusion. His estate, I thought that was all settled years ago. Something has come up, I said carefully, and it's very important. I need you to do something for me. Can you write down everything you can remember about the work you've done in the garden over the past 5 years? Be as detailed as you can. Dates, hours, what you did. It's crucial. He was quiet for a moment. Is this because of what Shane did? I heard about the garden. Aunt Martha, I am so sorry. I wanted to come over, but I was so angry I didn't trust myself to be around him. The genuine fury in his voice on my behalf was a balm to my raw nerves. Yes, Leo, it's because of that. Just trust me. Please. Of course, Aunt Martha. Anything. A week later, a thick envelope arrived. Inside was a 10-page, handwritten statement from Leo. It was a masterpiece of memory and detail, a love letter to a garden, and the uncle who had taught him to cherish it. He remembered the specific day he'd helped me stake the Graham Thomas's rose after a windstorm. He remembered the battle we waged against Japanese beetles in the summer of 22. He remembered the scent of the Gertrude Jekyll on a warm June evening. He sent it with a short note. I hope this helps. I miss him, and I miss the roses. I cried when I read it. Then I put it in a fresh envelope, along with copies of my journal pages and prints of the photos, and sent it all by courier to Howard Albright. The plan was in motion. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the animals to walk into it. The first move wasn't a thunderous declaration of war. It was a quiet surgical strike. It came in the form of a single cream-colored envelope delivered by a solemn-faced courier to my son's ostentatiously modern house. Following Howard Albright's precise instructions, I had done nothing. I hadn't answered Shane's calls, which had dwindled from a few half-hearted, just checking on you mom messages to a complete and telling silence. They thought my anger would burn out, that my grief would soften me up, and that eventually I would succumb to their vision of a concrete and chlorine backyard. They had no idea that my silence wasn't one of submission, but of strategy. The letter Howard drafted was a work of art in its brutal legalistic vagueness. It didn't mention the codicil. It didn't mention Leo. It certainly didn't mention the multi-million-dollar portfolio. It simply stated, in the driest possible terms, that due to the willful and deliberate destruction of a significant tangible asset named within the last will and testament of Arthur Pendleton, certain clauses pertaining to the inheritance and disposition of the estate were now under formal legal review by his representing counsel. It named Howard's firm and concluded with a chillingly polite, "We will be in contact in due course." The call came less than an hour after the courier confirmed delivery. The caller ID flashed. "Shane." I let it ring 4 times, then answered, my heart a steady cold drum in my chest. "Hello, Shane," I said, my voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. "Mom? What the hell is this?" There was no preamble, no "how are you," just raw, undiluted panic. The condescending tone he'd used for years was gone, replaced by a high-pitched bewilderment. "What letter? What legal review? What are you talking about? Tangible asset? Are you trying to sue me over some flowers?" I took a slow, deliberate breath, just as Howard had coached me. "I'm not trying to do anything, Shane. You are the one who hired a bulldozer. I am simply following the instructions your father left in his will. If you have any questions, you should direct them to his lawyer, Mr. Albright." His number was in the letter. I could hear Paige in the background, her voice a shrill shriek. "What does she mean? What is going on? Is she trying to take the house?" "The house?" Shane barked, clearly speaking to Paige before turning back to the phone. "Mom, you can't be serious. Dad left me the house. It's mine. Please direct all future questions to Mr. Albright." I repeated, the words a placid, impenetrable wall. "I have nothing more to say on this subject," and I hung up. I placed the phone back in its cradle, and my hand was perfectly steady. The fear was gone. The grief was still there, a permanent resident in the chambers of my heart, but it was now joined by a cold, righteous anger that felt like strength. The muddy pit in my backyard no longer looked like a grave. It now looked like a trap they had dug for themselves. Their panic escalated beautifully over the next few days. It was a multi-stage performance of desperation. First came the love bombing. A bouquet of cheap grocery store lilies arrived at my door with a card signed by Paige. "Thinking of you, Martha. We love you." I left it on the porch to wilt. Then came the text from Shane, a barrage of feigned concern. "Mom, please call me. We're worried about you. Mom, this isn't like you. Let's just talk this out. We were just trying to do something nice for you, to give you a space you could enjoy with us." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had never once considered my enjoyment. They had considered their own social climbing and property value. I deleted them all without replying. When the loving approach failed, they pivoted to guilt. This was Paige's specialty. She left a long, rambling voicemail, her voice quivering with theatrical hurt. "I don't know what we've done to deserve this, Martha. We think of you as a mother. We've tried so hard to include you in our lives, to modernize this house for you, and you repay us with lawyers. After everything Shane does for you, it's just cruel." I listened to the entire message, a faint, bitter smile on my lips. They had no idea what cruelty was. Finally, when guilt didn't work, they resorted to threats. Shane called again, and this time I didn't answer. He left a message, his voice tight with fury. "Fine, Mom. You want to play it this way. We'll get our own lawyer. A better lawyer. You have no idea who you're messing with. This is my house, my inheritance, and no dusty old will is going to change that. You'll regret this." That was the message Howard had been waiting for. It was an admission that Shane saw the house and any inheritance as an entitlement, not a gift. It was more fuel for our fire. Meanwhile, the construction on their grand patio had ground to a halt. The contractor, spooked by the legal letter Shane had no doubt mentioned, had pulled his men off the job, demanding assurances that the project was on solid legal and financial ground. Assurances Shane could not provide, so the pit remained, a giant, ugly, muddy monument to their greed, right in the middle of the backyard. Every time I looked at it, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It was their failure, on public display for all the neighbors to see. They had wanted a showpiece, a symbol of their success. Instead, they had a swamp. The ripples of that single certified letter spread further than I could have imagined. Families, especially ones with money and property involved, are like ponds. Toss in one stone of conflict, and the waves reach every shore. My sister Clara was the first to feel the shift. Initially, after the bulldozing, she had been sympathetic but also annoyingly pragmatic. "Oh, Martha, it's just awful," she'd said on the phone. "But you know how young people are. They don't think. I'm sure they didn't mean to be so hurtful." She had been trying to smooth things over, to play the peacemaker. But when I told her about the lawyer's letter, not the details, just the fact of it, her tone changed. "A lawyer, Martha. Are you sure? It's that serious?" "Yes, Clara, it is," I'd told her. It was that serious to Arthur, too. That was all it took. Clara, who had always adored Arthur, suddenly saw Shane and Paige's actions not as youthful thoughtlessness, but as a profound act of disrespect to her late brother-in-law's memory. Her neutrality evaporated. The next time Shane called her, looking for an ally to talk sense into his hysterical mother, she gave him an earful. The family's designated peacekeeper had officially joined my side. Next came the extended family, the cousins and aunts and uncles who gathered for holidays and exchanged Christmas cards. Shane had always been the golden boy, the successful son with the beautiful wife and the promising future. But the story of the bulldozed garden, followed by the news of lawyers, began to circulate. It was a story that didn't paint him in a flattering light. It smelled of greed and cruelty. People started to look at him differently. Invitations to family barbecues mysteriously got lost in the mail. Calls went unreturned. The warm, supportive network that had always surrounded him began to grow cold and distant. He and Paige were becoming pariahs in their own family, isolated by their own actions. The most satisfying exodus, however, was that of Paige's parents. The Hamiltons were obsessed with status. They had been insufferably proud that their daughter had married up into the old respectable Pendleton family with its lovely home, and they assumed significant generational wealth. Paige had been their trophy. But when Paige, in a fit of panicked desperation, told them that I was threatening the inheritance, they didn't rush to support her. They began to pull away. The last thing the status-conscious Hamiltons wanted was to be associated with a messy public and potentially costly family squabble. Their support for the golden couple was conditional, tied directly to the money and prestige they represented. With that now in question, their loyalty vanished. Shane and Paige, feeling the walls closing in, did exactly what Shane had threatened to do. They hired a lawyer. His name was Barry Croft, and from the letterhead on his first correspondence, he specialized in aggressive litigation. His letter to Howard was full of bluster and indignation. It called my claim frivolous, vexatious, and a transparent attempt to harass our clients. It demanded an immediate cessation of all legal action and a formal apology to Shane and Page, threatening a countersuit for emotional distress. It was exactly the kind of letter a bully hires another bully to write. Howard was not impressed. He didn't bother with a lengthy rebuttal. His response was simple, elegant, and devastating. He sent a single package back to Mr. Barry Croft via courier. Inside there was no letter, just 4 items. The first was a crisp, clear copy of Arthur's will, with the codicil highlighted in yellow. The second was a set of glossy 8x10 photographs, one of the rose garden in full magnificent bloom, taken just a month before its destruction, and another of the muddy, desolate pit it had become. The third was a copy of the contractor's work order, obtained via a quiet inquiry, which clearly stated client, Shane Pendleton, task, clear and level entire backyard garden area. The final item was the 10-page signed and now notarized affidavit from Leo, detailing his 5 years of continuous unpaid labor and love, a testament to his faithful maintenance of his uncle's legacy. Howard told me later that he got a call from Barry Croft 2 days after the package was delivered. The aggressive tone was gone. Howard, he'd said, his voice heavy with resignation, we may need to discuss a settlement. The power had shifted completely. They had come at us with noise and threats. We had defeated them with quiet, undeniable truth. The desperate request for a meeting came a week later, not from their lawyer to my lawyer, but from Shane himself. He left a voicemail on my phone, his voice stripped of all its previous anger and bluster. He sounded small, young, and terrified. "Mom," he said, "please, can we just meet? All of us, with the lawyers. At Mr. Albright's office. We need to sort this out." They were finally ready to surrender, but they still had no idea what they were surrendering to. The day of the meeting, I chose my outfit carefully. I wore a simple navy blue dress, the one Arthur had always liked. I wore the small pearl earrings he had given me for our 30th anniversary. I wanted to feel him with me, a quiet source of strength. I drove to Howard's office, my hands steady on the wheel. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I felt a profound and unsettling calm. The war was already won. This was just the signing of the treaty. They were already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly on the leather sofa in the waiting room. They both looked terrible. Shane's face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. Paige, who always looked so impeccably put together, was a mess. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, her makeup was smudged, and she couldn't stop twisting a handkerchief in her hands. They looked like what they were, cornered animals. We were led into the conference room. Howard was already seated at the head of the long polished table. Their lawyer, Mr. Croft, a man with a perpetually worried expression, sat with them. I took the seat next to Howard. For a few moments the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Shane broke the silence. He turned to me, his eyes pleading, "Mom, please. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. We're so sorry about the garden. We were wrong. We'll pay to have it replanted, anything you want. Just call this off." Paige nodded vigorously, her eyes wide and wet. "We'll put it back just the way it was, Martha. We promise." The offer was as pathetic as it was revealing. They still thought it was about the bushes. They still thought the damage could be undone with money. They had learned absolutely nothing. Howard cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Shane," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. He opened a file in front of him. "As you now know, your father's will contained a specific codicil regarding his investment portfolio." Mr. Croft shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Shane and Page leaned forward, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Howard continued. "The codicil stipulated that the portfolio, in its entirety, would be inherited by the heir who faithfully maintained your father's rose garden for 5 years after his passing. The destruction of that garden, I'm afraid, was an explicit and irreversible act of forfeiture on your part." Shane's face went white. "Forfeiture? What portfolio? What are you talking about?" And then Howard delivered the blow. He slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a recent statement from the investment account. At the bottom of a long list of stocks and bonds was a final number, a number with 2 commas in it, a number that represented more money than Shane and Page had ever dreamed of. I watched my son's eyes scan the page. I saw the moment he understood. His mouth fell open. A choked, strangled sound escaped Page's lips as she leaned over to see. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Ding, that can't be right," Shane stammered. He never had that kind of money. "Your father was a very shrewd and very private investor," Howard said quietly. "He wanted his wealth to go to someone with character, not just ambition." Shane's disbelief curdled into rage. He slammed his hand on the table, making the water glasses jump. "This is a trick. It was meant for me. I'm his son, not whoever. It's mine." Howard remained perfectly still. He let Shane's tantrum echo and die in the quiet, wood-paneled room. Then he delivered the final, fatal stroke. "The portfolio does have a rightful heir, Shane. The codicil's conditions were in fact met." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But not by you. They were met by your cousin Leo." He slid Leo's signed affidavit across the table to land next to the portfolio statement. The name Leo hit Shane like a physical blow. He flinched as if he'd been slapped. "Leo," he spat, the name dripping with contempt. "Skinny," broke Leo. "He's a part-time landscaper. He has nothing. Dad would never leave his money to him." And that was when I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a shard of glass. "Your father would have left his money to the person who valued his legacy," I said, looking directly into my son's eyes. "Leo valued the garden. He tended to it. He loved it. You saw it as a business opportunity. You bulldozed it for a swimming pool." I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the floor. "You never once in all these years bothered to learn the names of the roses, Shane. You never asked about their stories. You never understood what they meant to your father, or to me. Leo did. That, right there, is the difference." I looked at Paige, at her crumbling facade, and her eyes filled with a greedy, desperate horror. I felt nothing for her. Not pity, not anger, just a vast, empty distance. I turned and walked out of the conference room without a backward glance, leaving them alone with their lawyer, the consequences of their actions, and the deafening silence of a future they had just lost. A week later, I was standing with Leo in the sunshine of a sprawling plant nursery. The air smelled of damp earth, fertilizer, and the intoxicating perfume of 1,000 different flowers. It was the smell of life, of new beginnings. Leo was still in a state of quiet shock. When Howard and I had sat him down and explained everything, he had simply stared at us, his face pale, unable to process the numbers on the page. He had wept, not with joy, but with a kind of sorrowful gratitude. He trusted me, was all he could say over and over again. Uncle Arthur trusted me. He was a multimillionaire now, but he was still the same gentle, unassuming Leo. He hadn't thought about buying a sports car or a mansion. His first thought, his only thought, had been about the roses. "We have to plant a new garden, Aunt Martha," he'd said, his eyes shining with purpose. A bigger one, a tribute to him. And so here we were. He pushed the cart, and I pointed out the varieties: a Mr. Lincoln, a Queen Elizabeth, a Just Joey. We found a Pieces Rose, and we both smiled, but we couldn't find an Arthur's Light. It had been his own unique creation, and with the destruction of the garden, it was now extinct. A fresh pang of sorrow hit me, sharp and sudden. Leo saw it in my face. He put a hand on my arm. "We'll make a new one," he said softly. "We have his journals, his notes. We'll bring it back. And we'll name it after both of you." In his words, I saw the future. Not just a garden, but a living legacy, tended by hands that understood its true worth. He told me he was using a portion of the funds to establish a horticultural scholarship in Arthur's name at the local university, ensuring that other young people with a gardener's soul would have a chance to flourish. He was using the money to create, not just to consume. It was the perfect, most beautiful vindication I could have ever imagined. I don't see Shane or Paige anymore. I hear things, of course. News travels in a family, even a fractured one. Clara told me they had to sell the house. Without the expected windfall from Arthur's portfolio, they couldn't afford the property taxes, let alone the upkeep. The gaping, muddy pit in the backyard, a constant, ugly reminder of their folly, had made the property almost impossible to sell. They eventually took a lowball offer from a developer who, I'm told, plans to tear the whole house down. Their marriage, built on a foundation of shared ambition and future wealth, crumbled under the weight of their spectacular failure. Paige, apparently, couldn't tolerate being married to a man who had fumbled away a fortune. She left him. Shane is living in a small apartment somewhere across town, working a job he hates. He got exactly what his actions deserved, a life as empty as the hole he dug in my backyard. Some people, like my son, see value only in what can be measured in dollars and square feet. They look at a life's passion and see only an obstacle. They see a legacy of love and call it a bunch of thorny bushes. They never understand that true wealth isn't held in a bank or an investment portfolio. It's held in the heart. It's in the patience it takes to nurture something beautiful, the dedication to preserve a memory, the character to respect the legacy of those who came before you. My son and his wife failed a test they never even knew they were taking. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about respect. They laughed at my sentimental attachment, but it was that very sentiment that love, that memory that Arthur valued above all else. His will wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of preservation. He ensured his life's work, both the floral and the financial, would go to someone who understood that the most valuable things in this world are the ones that cannot be bought or sold. And in the end, the garden took care of its own. It always does. It's a story I felt I had to share, because I know I'm not the one out there who has felt overlooked or disrespected by the people who should love them most. I know what it feels like to have your deepest feelings dismissed as sentimentality. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever had to find the strength to stand up for what you value, please let me know in the comments below. Your stories give me strength, just as I hope mine gives you some. And if you believe, as I do, that true worth and character always reveal themselves in the end, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and vindication. Thank you for listening.